Well, it's a while since I've been up here, so let's see how it goes. But I wanted to talk today about restoring what was lost, because I think sometimes that we can kind of feel that there's things that we wanted to do or didn't do or might have done, or because of circumstances, perhaps like COVID, we've kind of lost what we wanted to do, or the timing that we thought we had. So I just wanted to kind of put some thoughts around that. I've been thinking a little bit about time and what time means, and what God's plan and purpose for us is. For those that don't know, I think it's been said, but I have taken 6 months leave just to rethink and recover and do a whole lot of things that would enable me to do the next season really well. And so it's led to a lot of thinking, a lot of thoughts about what I really want to do, who I really want to be, or really who God's created me to be, and those kind of things. So that preamble is pretty much all just to say I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know some of you think that I don't think much, but I actually do. I actually think quite deeply about a lot of things. Sometimes just the way I speak them out kind of blurts out in a rather awkward manner. However, let's start with some scripture, shall we? Joel 2:25-27. The Lord says, I will give you back what you lost to the swarming locusts, the hopping locusts, the stripping locusts, and the cutting locusts. Who knew that there were so many locusts? In fact, some translations call them other things, but when you look it up, they're pretty much just different types of locusts. It was I who sent the great destroying army against you. Once again, you will have all the food you want, and you'll praise the Lord your God, who does these miracles for you. Never again will my people be disgraced. Then you will know that I am among my people Israel, that I am the Lord your God, and there is no other. Never again will my people be disgraced. And I love that God says, I will restore the years the locusts have eaten. I will give you back what you lost. And so it made me sort of think, well, what are the kinds of things that the locust eats? Well, obviously, when there's a plague of locusts, and we get plagues of locusts in Australia, and Josh, I might just get you to throw that picture up for me of some locusts. We know that they eat through pretty much anything that's green. They just go through it. But there's something that's really interesting about locusts, because they're not always destructive. And I find it really interesting in this passage, just as an aside, that God actually said it was him who sent the locust to destroy. He was trying to teach Israel a lesson. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape or form that the locust plagues or the mice plagues that we get here in Australia are sent by God to be nasty to us in any way, shape or form. It's just not who God is. But when I think about it, I think it's interesting. It was actually as a result of their own behaviours that God had allowed this kind of destruction. But then he says he'll be faithful to restore. Now, I've asked Josh to put up this picture of locust. So let's take a quick look at the locust. It's actually a form of grasshopper. So a locust plague happens when a type of grasshopper changes from a grasshopper to a locust. So the picture that you can see of the top that is green is the green one is what they call the individual or isolated solitary form of a grasshopper. So a locust plague happens when a type of grasshopper changes from a grasshopper up the top to a locust down the bottom. And for many years, scientists actually thought they were different species. But it turns out that around 20 species of the 7,000 known grasshopper varieties transform into what they call a gregarious phenotype. But basically this means their bodies change as they socialise into swarms. And so I was just doing a little bit of reading, and this is what it says about them. Locusts and grasshoppers are the same in appearance, but locusts can exist in two different behavioural states, solitary and gregarious, whereas most grasshoppers do not. When the population density is low, locusts behave as individuals, much like grasshoppers. However, when locust population density is high, individuals undergo physiological and behavioural changes known as phase polyphenism, don't worry about the name, and they form gregariously behaving bands of nymphs or swarms of adults. In addition to changes in behaviour, phase change may be accompanied by changes in body shape and colour, in fertility, physiology and survival. These changes are so dramatic in some species that the swarming and non-swarming forms were once considered to be different species. The scale of population increase and migrations also distinguish these species known as locusts from grasshoppers, and that comes from the Australian Government Biosecurity, in case you were wondering where that came from. But there are actually these two different grasshoppers, and so we know that when a grasshopper hopping around, they're green, they eat a bit of grass, they don't cause too much damage, they might eat your favourite plant, but they don't go and destroy your whole garden, whereas a locust will just swarm straight through and destroy everything. And this is what the people of Israel had experienced. And I sometimes think that we can come to a point where in our life circumstances we feel like everything's been destroyed. Everything wasn't what we thought it would be, what we expected it to be. And so we kind of feel that there's this loss. And in some ways, the New Testament also identifies this kind of thing. In John 10:10, Jesus actually says, the thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. So Jesus actually speaks of a thief that destroys, a thief that kind of sneaks up and sneaks in and takes what isn't his. The difference is, of course, that a thief is sneaky. The grasshopper is really obvious. Like when you see a swarm of locusts, you don't go, oh, gee, I missed that. That was really sneaky. When you see a swarm of locusts, it kind of feels like complete and total overwhelm of everything. And so I think sometimes when the thief comes in, we can kind of feel like stuff has been lost. And I think the good news that I want to say today is that Jesus is our restorer. Jesus is the one, just as God said to the people in Joel, I will restore the years that the locusts have eaten. He also says that he will restore, that Jesus is the restorer, that Jesus is the one who brings life and brings it abundantly. And so what is God's abundance? Well, it can be all sorts of different things. For the Israelites, it was restoration of their farmlands, of their crops, of their wealth. I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Clearly sometimes it is that God restores a financial abundance to his people. But I think that when we think about it in different ways, it can also be an abundance of life that I like to call is an overflow of well-being. And I've noticed around the place at the moment, there's a lot of people who are not experiencing an overflow or an abundance of well-being. They're not experiencing that wellness in body, soul and spirit, or a wellness in relationships or in families or work. And so I want to encourage us to think, in our own personal circumstances, what does an abundant life really look like? What for me would an abundant life look like? Having experienced overwhelm and burnout and a few of those things that don't sound completely brilliant, and the journey that I'm still walking through for wholeness and wellness, what does an abundance of life look like for me? So here's a couple of thoughts. I think an abundance of life can look like peace, joy, fruit that is good, good works that glorify God, the gifts of the Spirit growing in our lives, the gifts of the Spirit bringing beauty and wholeness to others. And so this gets me to thinking, well, if we haven't had that and we've wasted our time, how does God restore abundance to that? And one of the things that, and again today, this is kind of more a collection of my thoughts and my thinking. I hope by the end of it kind of makes sense. But I kind of feel like we're coming out of a phase where, for many people, it's been quite destructive, quite isolating, quite overwhelming, that things haven't gone well. They haven't been able to see people that they love and care for. For some people, family has died, and they're walking through shocking grief. So what does restoration and abundance look like for that? I don't know that I have a real answer, except that Jesus, as we focus on Jesus, that he'll show us how to walk through those things, that he'll show us how to recover and to be restored through those things. I kind of feel that sometimes we waste our time on a lot of things too, things that kind of seem good. I don't know about you, but who has ever bought something that they thought was going to be really helpful, really useful, and perhaps their new hobby, and they have found it 5 years later in a room completely untouched? Or, like me, you bought what you thought was a great idea, a little folding table that was going to go up onto the wall and fold out when you wanted to do your craft. I bought that. I've lost track of how many years ago I bought that. Do you know it's still in its box? Cluttering up my house. And one of the things they talk about is decluttering, is letting go of the things that we thought we were, but we weren't. Letting go of the things that maybe you bought a whole lot of photography equipment that you thought, I'm going to be a great photographer, and it's gathering dust in a cupboard in a box somewhere. Adrian says he is a great photographer, and that is actually true, really true. However, I'm sure his photography gear does not just stay in a box. But in decluttering, they talk about letting go of things that weren't really us. We thought they might have been, but they weren't really us. And we can hold on to these ideas, they're ideas and false hopes that actually stop us from walking in God's best future for us. And so one of the things, maybe it's that you've wasted some money on some books that you're never going to read. I hear so many people say they've got a stack of 10 books. Now, some of you will read through that pile of 10 books. Those of you that aren't, can I encourage you to just rethink what you might really want to read and what you like reading, rather than what you felt you probably should read. Donate those books to someone who is going to read them, and save space. I have to say, and I won't tell you what book it was, but I was reading a book last night, and I just went through it, and I went, oh, that is just so bad. I don't even know that I can read the rest of that. This is just really a poor excuse for a theological argument. So I ditched it. Sorry for those who like theological arguments, but this was a really bad one. If you want to know what it is, you can come and talk to me later. So what are these things that we need to just get rid of and say, they're actually not helpful for us. They're not actually good. What do we actually need to let go? And so what do I personally need to let go of so that I can walk in God's best future for me? I've got a few months to work that out. It's amazing how quickly those months are going too. Look, I knew one of the things that I needed to do was to have my hip operation, which I've done, and I'm walking, and I'm really, really excited about that. But what about the things that you knew were God's things for you? The things that you maybe, deep down in your heart, God's called you to, but you've wasted time doing other stuff. Or you've thought that other stuff was more important because people told you that other stuff was more important. And so you've lost that hope and you've lost that dream. We've maybe let other things get in the way. I want to encourage us this morning to say that those dreams, those things that God has placed in your heart, he says that he gives us the desires of our hearts. Those things that he's placed in our heart, his desires for life, God will restore those and he will bring them back. Adrian talked last week about waiting for God's plans to unfold in his time. And it got me thinking about what time looks like. And I've had a few discussions with Liz about this. And those of you who know me well know that a long time ago, back in the dim dark ages, I actually did a science degree. So I actually quite like reading some of those things. But I came across a couple. So here's a dictionary definition of time first, because I think it kind of measures time in the way we measure time. So time is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process or condition exists or continues its duration. So we would say that COVID has existed since, I think it was for December 2019 that it first popped up in China. That COVID has existed for that duration of time. a non-spatial continuum that is measured in terms of events which succeed one another from past through present to future. And so we have this sense as human beings of that was in the past, this is the present, this is the future. One of the other things I love doing is listening to and reading about medieval history. I know, pretty weird, but hey. But you talk about, there's like past, present and future. And so I've been listening to and reading books that talk about, you know, the medieval period and the different ages and stages of that medieval period coming up to the Renaissance. So there's this sense that we have of human beings about time. But it's also interesting when we think about it. I looked up time and I found a couple of physicists who had, one was actually a neuroscientist, but a couple of things that they had to say about time. So this, I might just have a bit of trouble saying his name. It looks like Abhijit Naskar. He wrote a book called Love, God and Neurons, a memoir of a scientist who found himself by getting lost. He says, time is basically an illusion created by the mind to aid in our sense of temporal presence in the vast ocean of space. Without the neurons to create a virtual perception of the past and the future based on all our experiences, there is no actual existence of the past and the future. All that there is the present. So I just love that. I love this idea that it is just there to aid our sense of temporal presence in the vast ocean of space. I think that might become my favourite quote. But there's also another one called The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli, and it was written in 2018. It says, according to theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, time is an illusion. Our naive perception of its flow doesn't correspond to physical reality. Indeed, as Rovelli argues in the Order of Time, that's his book, much more is illusory, including Isaac Newton's picture of a universally ticking clock. Even Albert Einstein's relativistic space-time, an elastic manifold that contorts so that local time differs depending on one's relative speed or proximity to a mass, is just an effective simplification. And the person writing about this writes, so what does Rovelli think is really going on? He posits that reality is just a complex network of events onto which we project sequences of past, present and future. The whole universe obeys the laws of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics out of which time emerges. Understand all of that? Yeah, maybe. What they're really saying is that I think that our concept of time is actually not reality. That sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Like, what's real then? What is actually real? But it helps me to reflect on the fact that God's time is very different to ours. And he pops this in various places all the way through the Bible. So in the beginning, God already was. Well, there goes our idea of time, where something has a start, a beginning and a finish. God already was. So clearly God's time, really in our time. Revelation says that in John, he tells us that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Well, how can you be the beginning and the end all in one go? Well, Jesus is. He's the Alpha and the Omega. Because God is able, so what I think out of that is that God is able to use our time because that's something we understand, but he actually exists outside of that time. And he actually works outside of that time, which is why we have this thing called, God shows up at the last minute and sometimes just after the last minute. It's actually God's perfect time because he doesn't actually have time in the same way that we do. Are we now totally confused? Let me keep going. Isaiah 55:8-9 says this, "My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." So it kind of gives us, right back there in Isaiah, a little bit of an inkling that maybe God doesn't think the way we do. That maybe the way God thinks, maybe the way God sees things is slightly different. Psalm 90 verses 1-4 says, "Lord, through all the generations you have been our home. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from beginning to end you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, 'Return to dust, you mortals.' For you, 1,000 years are as a passing day, as brief as a few night hours." So God exists out of time. He kind of says, so we have that picture of a rope and we go, this is our time. Just this little tiny bit. Well, in a way that's true, because we are just mere mortals. We just have this breath. It describes us as a breath. But God doesn't see that rope as a linear, start here, finish there. It just doesn't see it that way. But it's kind of like the only way we can get our heads around it. Peter actually in the New Testament reaffirms this day is like 1,000 years, and he actually puts it in the context of people getting saved and why God or Jesus hasn't yet returned. And he says, but you must not forget one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord isn't really being slow about his promise, as some people think. No, he is being patient for your sake. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent. So I kind of start thinking, well, back to our locus and the destruction of that. How does God's time, how do you restore the years that the locusts of Eden? Well, you don't rely on our time for it. You rely on God's time for it, and in God's way of restoring, because he's not slow, and he's able to give you back that time simply because he doesn't exist according to our time and our perspective. He has a completely different perspective to us. So he's the one that can restore. So as I think about that, and if we continue that rope experience, I wonder, this is just me positing something, what if time was not linear, start, middle, end? That's kind of how we have our lives, isn't it? Birth, live at some, various decades, death. And we kind of always get a bit upset if death happens before we expect it to, stuff like that. And unfortunately in this world, those kind of things do happen. But what if God saw it quite differently? Now, I don't know, I'm a human being, and there is no way in the whole wide world that I can even comprehend the greatness, the goodness, the amazingness of God. But I kind of think, what if time was even just like a spiral? And what we saw as one point in that spiral, God actually saw right across the whole of the spiral and across all of eternity. What if that's how God saw time? What if I drew that on a piece of paper? I should have drawn it on the whiteboard. But what if I drew a spiral on a piece of paper and put a line and various lines through it? Because there's infinite a number of lines. So anybody who's done any maths should know that a line is actually an interval, and that a line goes on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Okay? Hard for us to get our head around. So the spiral is just going to go on forever and ever and ever, bigger, larger, whatever. And there's hundreds of ways you can dissect that. In fact, there's millions and billions and more than we can. God's thoughts about us, okay? All the way around that spiral. What if all of that was how God saw time? Look, I don't know. This is just me trying to make some kind of human sense of the greatness and goodness of God. So we tend to think of time as wasted or lost or not well used, or we think of time as well used, and we think of it as being, making the most of the time we have. And in some ways that is true. But how do we make the most of the time as we see it? Well, we trust in God's time, because he can restore what has been lost. He can restore what's been lost either by the hand of the enemy or by our own hand. What the people of Israel had lost was actually because they had not followed God, and they'd actually lost it by their own hand and by their own doing, and what they did was kind of like a consequence of that. And God is saying, man, you made a really big stuff up here, but you know what? Doesn't matter, I'm faithful. I'm going to restore it, and I can give you back what was lost. Well, how do you get those years back? In human terms, we can't. But in God's time and in God's purposes, you can. So to God, time is of no essence. He actually lives outside of time, and he can restore those things outside of our time. This is why I think the death and resurrection of Jesus, as we see it in one point of history, was actually so effective for all time, because it was God's time and not our time. And Jesus' death and resurrection is enough for right across the ages of what we call our time. So just a couple of points as we kind of try and take this somewhere, bring it to something that we can actually do maybe and understand. I think one of the things we have to do is let go of time as we know it and find God's rhythm of time? What's his rhythm of time for you and I? That may look different for different people. But what is God's rhythm of time? We've been doing a book in our discipleship group called Sacred Rhythms, and it's all about how to spend that time and better time with God and knowing God and listening to him. But let go of time as we know it. I mean, I don't know about you, but there are some times when I can just really focus on something. They call it hyperfocus actually, but you really hyperfocus on something and hours will go by. And it feels like 5 seconds. And there's other times when things are really, really boring. And I hope this is not you this morning. But 5 minutes seems to go on forever. At the gym, that 1 minute or 2 minute exercise, it feels like flipping eternity. I mean, really, that just goes to show that we have this mixed up concept of how time works anyway. But let go of our sense of what time is. Does this mean that we do nothing and just let God do it all? No, of course we don't. There are some things that God has actually asked us to do. And one of the things we do as we let go of time is that we do what we do know to do. And that is to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, to spend time with God. And let God work in those rhythms of life. You know, Jesus talks, I think it's in the Message translation where it says, you know, come to me all you who labour and heavy laden is the normal way that we know it. But he talks about the untold rhythms of grace and just allowing those rhythms of God's grace to work for us. Because God works in the rhythms of our lives. And he actually uses what we understand of time to do that. And he helps us with that. You know, there's the rhythm of the seasons, there's the rhythm of the way things are, the tides, the days and the nights. And interestingly about the tides, there's this rhythm to them, but they're not the same every day. They don't come up to the same height, and they don't come, even though a tide comes in and out twice a day, it's actually just over twice a day, I think, but they come in and out pretty much twice a day. But they're never the same height, they're never the same level. One tide is higher than the other highest tide at some times of year. There's a really high tide, and look, it's to do with all sorts of things that I don't completely understand, but I'm guessing astrophysicists probably do, so ask them. But there's all these rhythms that God places in our lives to help us understand the flow and the ebb of what he actually wants from our lives. So learn his rhythms and not what others think is his timing for you. Not what others think is his timing for you. In the business world, and it probably makes sense in a way in the business world, there are people who say now to get the most out of time, you actually have to record what you do every 15 minutes. And I know Ron's spoken about having to do that at times. And that just overwhelms me straight away because I cannot work in that kind of situation. But it probably works for, 8 out of every 10 other person on the place of this earth. But find out what works for you. Let God's rhythms, let God's pace, let that direct your life, not what others are thinking. When you go to work, when you're looking after your family, when you're doing things that you know to do what you know. And trust God to bring his time into the restoration of your life. Because he might just turn everything upside down. And you'll end up living something completely different to what you thought it was. But it's God's best for you. It's God's restoration for you. The second thing that I want to say is just do what God calls you to do. There are things that we can do as we look for restoration. We can wait patiently. Oh, who loves patience? Not me. But we can wait patiently. We can make disciples. We can connect with people. We can let go of the things that we thought we were going to do. That good idea that we had, that still unfinished project in the garage or in the spare room, or in our case, out under the carport. There's a few unfinished projects out there. So get in and finish them, or go, that was just a bad idea, we need to get rid of it. I think I might have said this before, but many, many, many years ago, we thought we would make some adjustments to our driveway, and we thought we'd widen part of it. We put a post in. We dug a hole, and we put a post in, and we fully intended to get that finished. However, and we Whalans have had a few of these kind of projects, I must say. There are some things that are really just not us that we've tried to do because other people could do them. We just can't. Let's just recognise that we can't and get other people to do them for us. That post stayed there for I do not know how many years. Just a post. We were never going to do that project. So the best thing to do is take that post out, and get on with life, which is what we did. Sorry for my kids for all those projects that, if you've got a problem about that, come and see us, because we'd love to help you through that. But what are the things that God's asking us to let go of so that we can take hold of the things that he's causing us to do? Because restoration comes when we let go of what was, when we let go of what has been, when we let go of the things that have no longer served us, when we let go of the idea that we have to control everything, when we let go of all the things in our life that are really unhelpful for us and get about what God is calling you to do. And if you're not sure what that is, then ask God. It says that he will give you the desires of your heart. And I don't think that's him saying, oh, you've got a great desire there, I'm going to make sure you get that. No, it's in relationship with him. Delight in the Lord, it says. Delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So as you delight in God, he will show you what it is that you really desire and what it is that he is actually calling you to do. So what is God asking you to let go of? What are the things that you and I are holding on to so tightly? Can I be just a little bit contentious and say maybe we're holding on to theological views that aren't right or that aren't helpful? You can come and fire arrows at me later. But what is it that we need to let go of so that we can take on the correct theological views? I'm not saying we shouldn't have theology. What I'm saying is let's let go of those things that actually aren't right. Let's examine and rethink and learn and unlearn a whole lot of stuff. Because in the process of doing that, we'll actually find what it is that God wants us to do. And he will restore those things that are good and helpful to you and allow you to flourish. And really, that's what it is. Only you can answer for yourself what those things are. But as I reflect on this, I think that there are ideas and thoughts and activities which I've done over the past that though in themselves were not bad, they're good ideas and thoughts and ideas, they haven't actually been helpful to me. I can't tell you the number of diaries I have tried to start and journals I have tried to write, or glasses for that matter, that I have tried not to lose. I have 3 sets of glasses and I don't know where any of them are at present. There's a reason for that, which you can come and talk to me about later. But the thing is that they just don't work the same way for me as they do for other people. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't journal. I love journaling and I can do it for a bit and then I lose my journal. And then we start again, and then 5 years later I find a journal that says... In fact, I found one the other day that's got this really great stuff on it, and it says 2012. It's been sitting there for 9 years. I've written other things since then. I've journaled other things. I find my phone really, really helpful for this kind of stuff because it actually really does help me to keep everything in the one place. But what is it that works for you? I've had to let go of the idea that buying a diary for 2022 is going to be a good thing for me. I even bought a mental health diary last year because I was wanting to go and work on my mental health this year. Don't ask me where that mental health diary is. I think I used it twice. See, it just doesn't work for me. I've got to let go of that idea. Now, for you, it might be something else. What is it that you need to let go of that's actually limiting you, frustrating you, overwhelming you, that you just need to let go of? I know for some of you, having that journal and that diary is the best thing that you can do because you can write in there, you can put everything you need to know in there, and it's actually really helpful for you. And if that's you, go for it. Use it. Use what's going to help you and let go of the things that you're doing that aren't helping you at the moment. And the third one, which I think is really important, and I think we're not particularly good at, although I think we are getting better, is to take time to rest. Take time to rest. I did some training last year as a spiritual life coach to add to my leadership coaching that I've done. It was an interesting experience. But one of the things that I noticed that is really important, and the Bible talks about it all the time, is to spend time in quietness, in solitude, not necessarily emptying your head of everything, but in a kind of mindful way, in a meditative way, And how often have we been told to meditate on the Word of God in quietness? Take that time out just to sit and spend time with God. So take time in the presence of God where you're not actually speaking. I know a lot of my time when I'm praying, it's just me prattling off a whole lot of stuff that maybe God actually isn't even interested in. Okay, God is interested in me, and I'm sure he's interested in what I'm doing. But I think about a lot of the stuff that I just prattle on about to God, and he's gone, I think you've lost the plot, Jill. Actually, what's more important is this. But because I'm spending time with him, he can actually direct me to this. If I'm not spending time with him, then I can just go on in my own little way and get overwhelmed. Romans 12, 1-2 says this, and you will have heard this from plenty of us before. So, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. So you notice in this, it starts off with worshipping God with everything that we are. I don't think giving our bodies is just our physical body. I think it's everything that we are. It's our whole self because of everything that he has done. And live in a way that honours him and that worships him. And then it says, as you do that, don't copy the behaviour and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Now, depending on what translation you have, it may or may not come out quite like that. Some translations say, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can know it. So here's the question. Is it God who changes how we think, or is it us? Is it God who changes how we think, or is it us? Because from that particular reading of it, it could be either. I want to say it's actually not either or. I think it's actually both. Let me explain. We think we do the work, only to find it was actually because we sought God that the way we think changes. So we think we're working on changing the way we think. But actually true change only comes when we rest in him, know him, and become like him, and allow him to guide and direct those thoughts. And then we begin to change those thoughts. So yes, there's things we can do. We know with neuroscience now that you can focus on something and it will change the neurons in your brain. Isn't it amazing that God actually created our brain to do that? See, even when we think we're doing it on our own, I'm just going to sit here, I'm going to focus, I don't want to focus on that path, I want to focus on the new path that whoever it is encouraging me to focus on. Hopefully it's the right path for you. But we can do that not because we're really great at changing the way we think, because we're actually pretty crappy at it. Sorry, did I say that? No. We're actually pretty bad at it. We really struggle with it. But God has created our brains. The things actually happen in our brains because of the way that God has created our brains to be able to change, and because his spirit connects with us, body, soul, and spirit. So as we finish up, I want to encourage us that God can restore. God restores us because the years the locusts have eaten are restored because God's time is not our time. His ways are not our ways. So as we get to know him more, that we understand him better and we learn to live his way, we can then relax. We can let go of the need to live in our time. We can find rest in God. We can do the things that he's called us to do in time and outside of time. Thank you.